Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
On 9/11, 1973, a disaster even greater than that which occurred in 2001 took place. The 9/11 hijackers mercifully failed to hit the White House. But in Chile, the bombers didn't miss. President Salvador Allende was murdered in his palace, clutching the AK-47 given to him by the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro. In the Chilean 9/11, senators and congressmen were slain, as were tens of thousands of their supporters, many of them tortured and murdered in Santiago's National Football Stadium, leaving much blood on the grass.
We mention Chile not just because it's the 9/11 the United States forgot, and not just because it's the reason our first guest is in Britain to begin with. His parents are Pinochet torture survivors and came here as exiles. But moreover, because some say that the US is currently trying to repeat Chile in Venezuela, which happens to be his particular area of expertise.
He is Pablo Navarrete, a celebrated filmmaker and journalist, and he joins us now. Pablo, thanks for doing so. You've got a movie coming out soon, The Hip-Hop Revolution. That's certain to pack them in. I'm not sure if I'm a hip-hop sort of guy, but I'm certainly up for revolution. Tell us about the film.
Hip-Hop Revolution is a documentary that looks at a trip that I took with Loki, a quite celebrated political rapper. After making a first film about Venezuela, which was a general look at the 10 years of the Chavez government, trying to address some of the inadequacies of the misrepresentations of the mainstream media.
That one is called Inside Revolution.
That's called Inside the Revolution. That came out in 2009. And I made a feature on Colombia, but I always wanted to go back and look at this particular collective of hip-hop revolutionaries, activists, who used hip-hop as a means to inspire people in their neighbourhood to talk politics, to educate. So this film is a trip with Loki and Jodie McIntyre, a young activist.
We know him well too.
And we went to Venezuela and spent some time there.
How is it possible that Colombia, which is still a playground of death squads and, if not dictatorship, certainly authoritarian government now, gets such a smooth ride, in fact, is more or less left entirely alone in the Western media, whilst Venezuela, which has transformed the lives of the majority of its citizens for the better, is constantly picked on, not least by the so-called liberal media. I'm thinking of The Guardian, Rory Carroll, whoever he is. I hope I never meet him, I must tell you that. He'd better hope I never meet him. Why does that happen?
It's a very good question, and one that I've asked myself on many occasions. You know, Venezuela, as you say, a country that it's important not to idealise, but there have been massive transformations. Previously excluded sectors have been brought into the political process. You go there, there's debates on socialism, on participation, community radio stations, you know, plethora of activities, grassroots activity. And I've been to Colombia, and you have social leaders, the most amount of unionists killed every year, billions in funding by the US government, secret military aid by the British, a recent scandal where 6,000 civilians have been murdered by an army funded by the West. And you'd think that this was an issue that the Western media might want to cover, yet not only do they not cover it, but they concentrate their ire on Venezuela, Chavez dictator, no freedom of expression. And I think if you look at the coverage of Venezuela and in Colombia, you get a real insight into the motivations of the Western corporate media and state-funded media. And, you know, it's a question that I would love them to answer, why they feel they can ignore the gross human rights violations in Colombia.
In the neighbouring country?
In the neighbouring country, and basically serve as a soapbox for the political opposition in Venezuela to repeat every allegation that they want.
You see, I have no doubt why Western governments would want to do that. What I don't quite understand is by what process of osmosis all these journalists, including liberal ones, suddenly wheel their guns in the same direction.
There is a deep ignorance, for example, on Latin America in Britain. I did meet Rory Carroll. He rang me when I lived in Venezuela. I was working for John Pilger as his researcher on his documentary, The War on Democracy, which looks at US's interventions in countless Latin American countries, Chile, etc., etc. And he rang me because he wanted help with contacts. And, you know, he was someone that obviously he didn't speak Spanish, which I did find very shocking, I guess. He didn't know anything about Latin America. And I, perhaps rather naively, was a bit surprised by all this, thinking, you know, The Guardian, a very established newspaper, would send someone who didn't speak Spanish and didn't really know anything about Latin America.
He's British.
To be their first Latin America correspondent in 25 years. With the last
probably
one
followed the ancient rule of merely speaking louder in English when speaking to foreigners. Now, let's talk about your life for a minute. I'm fascinated by it because Chile was something extremely important to me. I followed every day of the crisis that led to the overthrow of Allende and the massacres and so on afterwards. Here you are speaking to us in an English accent, but still your heart is in Latin America. And not just in Chile, because of course one of the new phenomena is the Latin Americanism. Is that a fair summary of where you are? Your heart's there?
I think a large part of my heart feels Latin American rather than Chilean. You know, I've only been to Chile 4 times. My parents were banned from going until democracy formally returned in 1990. I've spent a lot of time in Venezuela. I've travelled to Colombia. I've travelled to pretty much all the countries in Latin America. And certainly I do feel a connection with this new wave of pan-Latin Americanism that has swept the continent, of which Hugo Chavez played such a key role in serving as a catalyst for. And actually, when we were filming Hip Hop Revolution, it was also the founding meeting of CELAC, the new regional body. The first time ever that the region has come together to have a regional body, Latin America and the Caribbean, except the US and Canada. And I think these are sort of historic organizations, and they reflect a spirit of the times where the US has been so brazen in its attempts to interfere that, you know, there's a new, bold leadership across the region that says enough is enough, and we can do things our own ways, and we'll, you know, it's time to really try and stand up to this bully in the north.
To the behemoth.
So yeah, I feel that this is a good thing, and it's something that I...
Well, it's a good thing for Latin America. It's also a very good thing for the world, of course, which needs new poles to come onto the international stage. The unipolar world not only is over, but has to be over, and was perilously dangerous while it existed. But central to that pan-Latin Americanism was, of course, the larger-than-life figure of Hugo Chavez. May God have mercy upon him. He is gone now. To what extent is the process thus endangered, on the principle that there are not 2 Hugo Chavezes, neither in Venezuela nor in the world?
Well, obviously, even his most strident critics admitted that Hugo Chavez was a larger-than-life character. His charisma was overwhelming, even. And, you know, they hated him, but they also feared him because of what you know, how charismatic he was. And obviously there are no 2 Hugo Chavezes, but I think, again, what I wanted to do with the first film was to depersonalize everything, because here it's the obsession about the individual. And I think that is done on purpose, actually, because it serves to...
Makes it fragile.
It makes it all about the individual. It personalizes the process. These are historic processes in Latin America that have been, you know, drowned in blood by the US on numerous occasions. But that, you know, people's desire for freedom, this is what one of the Venezuelan, a friend and a community activist who I interviewed for my first film, said, all we want is to be free. And, you know, he summarized what it was that they were about. And I asked him to summarize what had been achieved in 10 years. And he said, consciousness and inclusion. So, you know, so much has been done. Yes, there are lots of challenges, especially now in Venezuela again with the new renewed sort of fascist onslaught that there is to remove the government, again supported by the US.
It is an attempt to replicate Chile 9/11, 1973.
Of course, I mean,
think?
and Chile was an attempt to replicate Guatemala, and Guatemala was an attempt to replicate previous governments that went in Latin America before that, because unfortunately the US does not want to allow governments who want to be independent to pursue policies that benefit the broad majorities because of whatever their corporate, allies who put pressure on them. But, Nixon said we will make the economy scream. And just on Saturday, I was in Manchester showing some films at this wonderful miners' centre, and we watched The Battle of Chile, an incredible documentary trilogy by Patricio Guzman, a very celebrated Chilean director. And watching it again and seeing the shortages, how food shortages were done, political strikes, the CIA-funded strikes. Yeah. You look at Venezuela, and it's the parallels are striking.
The replica, right down to the lack of toilet paper.
Exactly. And in Chile, the day after the coup, all this so-called the food, the shortages just all appeared again. Yeah. And when I lived in Venezuela, middle-class area, I went, and the businessmen were turning food away. We don't want goods in this. They wanted to create the conditions so that people would feel uneasy. The psychological issue in Chile before the coup, they were saying, remember Jakarta, they were writing, trying to scare people about Indonesia. In Venezuela, they were telling, when I was there, they were telling children at universities that they would have to go to Cuba, forced to study in Cuba. So that, they use a range of tactics. Yeah.
Literally manufacturing the
fear.
Fear, yes.
Yeah, but I think, the positive thing is that it looks like in Venezuela that the process will continue, and it's a testament to the fact that it's not just about one man, it's about ordinary people, hip-hop activists, community workers, old ladies who have, as I say, consciousness and inclusion and feel that they have something that's worth defending.
I'm going to get practice. Is it dance? Is hip-hop dancing or just listening?
Hip-hop, no, you can just listen.
You can listen, but you don't have to dance.
You don't have to dance.
All right, I'll practice. Hip-hop revolution. Make a date. Coming up after the break, we're looking at Britain's greatest invention, the National Health Service, and talking to another celebrated filmmaker about how it's under threat of being murdered in the intensive care ward in its 67th year. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Sputnik. Britain, as the first industrial country, has many great achievements to its name, but none greater than the innovative socialist idea within the capitalist world of a national health service, free at the point of need and funded by progressive taxation. We've all had cause to be grateful for it, and with a wife in the late stages of pregnancy, Gayatri and me have all our hopes pinned on it. But it's in dire danger of being strangled by underfunding and creeping, remorseless privatisation. Our next guest is making the crowd-funded documentary film Sell-Off, which charts the conspiracy to murder the National Health Service. His name is Peter Bach, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Peter, I suppose people like me could be accused of crying wolf on this subject. I've been talking about the remorseless creeping privatisation of the NHS since the 1980s. Am I exaggerating when I say it's in danger of being strangled to death?
Well, I think the National Health Service that existed when you were, I think it was 10 when you joined the Labour Party, was a robust, very much loved, as I think it still is today, institution, and now it's unrecognisable. I don't know how it's been done so stealthily. I don't know how it is that the public have missed this trick. But essentially what we have now is an NHS that has technically been abolished.
Tell me why.
Well,
or how, rather.
Well, the responsibility, and again, you must remember, from my point of view, I've learned all this in the course of making a film, but the responsibility that was always held by the Secretary of State for Health was the nation's health. Mm-hmm. And somewhere...
Nye Bevan, the founder, said if a bedpan falls in Bedvelte in the South Wales valleys,
yes,
its echo will be heard in the chamber of the House of Commons, because the Minister will have to answer for it.
Well, its echo is being heard by me every time I think about the subject, but I'm amazed how little the echo seems to have resounded in the ears of so many others. But going back to the state of the Health Service, the Secretary of State for Health, his responsibility, her responsibility, was always the nation's health, and that has been removed. Or, as the public interest lawyer Peter Roderick says in the film, it's been untethered in his wonderful Welsh tones. And this is the scary thing. There is no longer a responsibility. There are people afoot trying to reverse this, people like Professor Alison Pollock.
Yes, she's a very great expert. Yeah.
Exactly, and she features in the film and is a great help to me and therefore the public, because, as I've just said, my ignorance really led my confidence to go through the film. If I had approached it as an expert, I think you would have seen a weak, rather pompous film.
So how did you come across this topic?
Well, it was a very personal story, and in so much as I think the personal is always better. And what happened was I was approached by a group of doctors, and with an element of mystery, I was invited to a basement flat in Earl's Court, and it was snowing, and the stone steps were very slippery. And I remember thinking, perhaps nervously, because I didn't quite know what was going to happen with all these doctors I knew were waiting for me, I thought, if I fall, if I crack my head...
How are you going to explain what you were doing in a basement flat in Earl's Court?
Well, there is that as well, but what I was actually thinking, less playfully, and perhaps I should have been more playful, was that there were all these doctors inside who would have been able to help me. But in fact, they didn't really help me, because what they did was they shocked me. And they told me, like desperate people, what was happening to something I had never given the time of day to. And they were highly seasoned doctors, time-honoured practitioners, great people who believed strongly in the essential egalitarianism of the concept, let alone the practicalities of the medical knowledge they had. And they were broken, some of them. And they looked at me as somebody who they knew was a one-person kind of filmmaker who didn't come with the cumbersome, you know, politics of a broadcasting company, necessarily different, obviously, than from how you were going about it. And they had the savviness to know that perhaps if I could find a way of telling that story, it might be a useful means of trying to get across to people what they felt is not getting across. And I believe that is because of mainstream media. And I have one of my 10 chapters, which is why media and mainstream media has let down the public in this story.
Why would politicians seek to abolish what is overwhelmingly regarded in the country as our finest achievement, the jewel in our crown? And especially at a time when in the United States, albeit very piecemeal, Obama is trying to move in the direction we used to be in.
Yes, there is an irony, because to mention Professor Alison Pollock again, she sees the engine for all of this actually originating from the United States, which meanwhile is doing what it can to change its system. But it would appear to me a very simple case of neoliberalism gone mad, whereby without any proof, the belief is that you can save money, but of course the expectations are that administrative costs alone, including insurance and such like, will mean what is 7%, say now, of our £100 billion annual health budget will become 30% to administration. And the great mistake, and again, this is fresh information to me, so I speak with genuine shock myself, the great mistake everyone seems to be making is they think you can save money by privatising it, and you can't. And I'm sure, you know, from your point of view, this is one of those well-worn arguments that you're aware of.
Well, I was there, Peter, at the beginning, when Mrs. Thatcher came to power, knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. We defended the National Health Service in terms of its values. But actually, looking back on it, we could equally have defended the National Health Service in terms of its price. Because there's nothing cheaper about privatisation, neither of the railways or of the utility companies or of the National Health Service. All you're doing is actually moving money from the front line, staff and patients, to administrators and fat cats and chief executives and all the rest.
Yes.
Is that what you found in your investigation?
Yes, I did. And I also actually found that all the major political parties were complicit in it.
Yes.
There was no
Blair
way...
started all this.
Well, John Major and Tony Blair very much so. And in fact, one of the doctors I speak to, who is a marvellous clinical oncologist based in Middlesbrough, who reminds us of that phrase that when Thatcher was asked what her greatest achievement was and answered Tony Blair, in a sense, his perpetuation of the privatisation, and, for example, the PFIs is a classic case, one of the 10 themes that the film covers. Yeah. That's what I've come across, is this dead-end sequence of places that I can't go down, really, without slamming into resistance, which is why it strikes me that any sensible political party, if it actually stood up and admitted the importance of this National Health Service, it would be a vote winner.
Indeed. I was, for 5 years, the MP for the area, including the Royal London Hospital. A misnomer, of course, because you'd never find anybody royal in the Royal London Hospital. And its PFI, when you broke it down, the cost that the country is going to pay for the next half-century for the private funding of this hospital, it was costing us £1 million per bed.
Extraordinary.
Per year.
Amazing.
£1 million per extra bed. Of course, if we had stayed faithful to the principles that Nye Bevan founded the National Health Service on, we'd have had a better service, and the party that had stood up for it would have been rewarded publicly.
Right.
So I'm still not clear why they do it.
Well, exactly. And another reason for continued lack of clarity on your part would be that those who say, oh, it's a socialist mantra and essentially it has to be ripped apart and slapped with the real world, forget that actually it's egalitarianism meant that the really wealthy had free medicine too. And it was by no means something that was exclusively, you know, for those of us without. I am confused still to this day why people don't wake up to it.
Yeah.
But
well, maybe your film will be a big wake-up call.
Well, I hope so. I do hope so. What it does do is it makes itself aware of the fact that any documentaries we're seeing presently, some of them very well made about medicine, are single issues and perhaps half an hour long. And my film does attempt to tell the whole story, because I think there are 10 central planks all surrounding this abolition, dismantlement, whatever we wish to call it. And you can't tell the full story without telling and explaining each of those planks together. And there are those, of course, who think there's a conspiracy. And the management consultants, all sorts of people are standing to benefit so much because, as I have somebody explaining...
Well, it's big business, Peter, yeah.
And the American market is saturated.
If you get 7% or 17% of £100 billion pounds, that's really big money. That's big business.
Very big money.
I mean, that's... I mean, you could choose. You go into property speculation or go into healthcare management.
Yeah. And now we have things like clinical commissioning groups, whereby the public were fed the line that we're giving the power back to the GPs. But of course, the GPs have no experience of marketing and business and purchasing.
So they buy in business people to do it for
them.
They outsource
they
it.
do. And of course, you know, there's a lot of pressure being put on doctors who've already got quite enough. We know the doctor is well paid, but what we don't often acknowledge sufficiently is that they're overworked. And I think also there's talk among some of the doctors of a deliberate attempt to make them look like a failing enterprise.
Yeah, set up to fail.
And the morale is very poor because of that.
How can we help your film? How can we help fund it?
Well, it would be a marvellous thing if people could direct their attention to Start Join, that's S-T-A-R-T, Join, where there is a direction to the film. It's Sell Off, it's NHS. I have put up there a fresh trailer that I've just made because I've
seen it. It's very, very good, very powerful. So it's startjoin.com, and then you head for the movie called Sell Off. Peter Bach, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So what's happening in Venezuela and how do we know? Wake Up UK answers, I've actually no idea because I do not trust the source of information regarding Venezuela anyway. L Tweeterer says, The same has happened in Egypt. They want the overthrow of democratically elected government, to which our own beloved William Hague then responds.
The William Hague?
Our beloved William Hague.
Okay.
If Venezuela has oil, gas or opium, we'll give them democracy too.
Very good. Well, of course, RT is the proper source to follow events in Venezuela. There is a conspiracy, probably not centrally organized, but there's a conspiracy to do down Venezuela.
Yeah.
It is the
biggest
biggest...
replica of Chile.
And for obvious material reasons, it's the biggest supplier of oil to the United States.
About the NHS, John Wansby answers that it was the greatest post-war social innovation, currently being sold piece by piece to leeches by our elected officials. Well, that's it for this week.
Which sadly means that's the end of the show.
Do keep in touch with us on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.